Is drinking raw milk safe like RFK Jr. suggests? Can you reduce a glucose spike if you eat your food in, quote-unquote, the right order? I'm registered dietitian Abby Sharp. I host a nutrition myth-busting podcast called Bite Back with Abby Sharp, and those are just some of the questions I tackle with qualified experts on my show. There is so much food misinformation and disinformation out there, and it can feel impossible to know what's real and what's BS. On Bite Back, my goal is to help listeners create a pleasurable relationship with food, their body, and themselves, which in my opinion is the fundamental secret to good health. Listen to Bite Back wherever you get your podcasts.
Whether it's work, play, or a little of both, the right vehicle makes all the difference. No matter where you're headed, Ted Britt Chevrolet is here to find the perfect vehicle at an incredible price. Lease a new 2025 Equinox EV for just $149 a month, or save over $11,000 off MSRP on a new 2025 Silverado 1500. Visit Ted Britt Chevrolet today in Sterling for savings that take you further, or shop online at tedbrittchevrolet.com. Together, let's drive.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
They call it the most lawless place on Earth, the ocean. The vast abyss open and embracing to anyone and anything that encounters it. Its blurred lines and ambiguous regulation welcoming to any sort of interpretation of where the law ends and where the free-for-all begins. Thousands of migrants make their choice of freedom or death, paying smugglers to take them from Tripoli, the capital of Libya, into Mediterranean waters for a chance at a better life in Italy. And that's where we find the Outlaw Ocean Project, a team of journalists who risk their lives to cover the stories that otherwise would have never been told, all in the name of justice. I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Ian Urbina, director of the Outlaw Ocean Project and host of the Outlaw Ocean Podcast. We're diving into season 2 of the anthology, where he details his near-death experience, covering the story of a West African man who was killed while trying to make it to Italy from Libya. Ian, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Ian, I want to start off by kind of zooming out a little bit before diving into it. You know, one of the ways your project describes the work that it does is by saying it explores the most lawless place on Earth, the ocean. You know, what was the moment in your career that made you think twice about what went down in the waters, and so much so to start a project to investigate it?
Yeah, it began when I was on staff at the New York Times. I was doing investigative work there for 17 years, and the last big project was an exploration of the watery two-thirds. The thing that struck me first was, lo and behold, there are more than 50 million people that work at sea, and I always think of it as sort of a watery desert where there's no one. And so that there were so many people out there doing whatever, and so little journalism intrigued me. And then I remembered a stint I did before I became a journalist. I was working as an anthropologist, and I spent several months with seafarers, and they told me some of the wild stories of what that life was like. And I thought, wow, you know, this would be a really great target for exploration.
So season 2 begins with a 3-part series where you and your team head to Libya to look into these secret prisons that would house hundreds of migrants after capturing them as they made their way to Italy by sea. And the story that you chose to highlight was that of a West African man named Aliou Candé, who, you know, unfortunately set the stage almost for just how grave this sort of journey is. Take us through his story.
Aliou Candé was sort of a textbook climate migrant from a very poor African country, Guinea-Bissau. His 2 brothers had left their village and successfully made their way to Europe, one in Spain, one in Italy, and they were sending money back. But, you know, Ali had kids, a wife, parents to look after, and things were getting pretty dire in his village. So he decided to make the journey. He initially wanted to go through Algeria, couldn't afford the boat, so went instead to Libya. Libya is a lawless state. You know, it's 2011 toppling of Gaddafi just become pure chaos. And that's been a boon for those who traffic or transport migrants seeking to get to Europe and try to find a better life. It's also a good launching point, Tripoli in particular, because it's only about 100 kilometers till you touch an island called Lampedusa, which is Italy. And so it's a shorter trek than if you launch from other places. So Aliou paid a guy to take him across the Mediterranean and was in a boat with a couple hundred other migrants, but were captured by the Libyan Coast Guard and brought back to shore and put in a prison, a particularly brutal prison.
Right. I'm curious as to how you found Aliou Candé. Like, how did you encounter his story?
So it took a lot of prep to get a visa to be allowed to work in Libya. So that was a year-long process. When we finally got the green light to be allowed in the country, we scrambled to figure out who would be our sort of poster child, sort of narrative driver. There had been 2 weeks prior to our arrival, a prison riot or a fight that broke out at the most notorious of the prisons there, a place called Al-Mabani. And this was a place that was notorious because very few aid organizations were allowed in there. But the stories that came out when migrants were released or escaped were pretty dark. Exploitation, a lot of rape, murder, torture. And so we thought, well, if we could find a way to tell someone's story who was in Al-Mabani, that would be amazing. And there had been this violent incident 2 weeks before we got on the plane, and a couple guys had died. So we began figuring out, well, could we figure out the identity of one of those guys and tell their story?
That kind of leads me into my next question, actually. When you were preparing for your trip to Libya, what kind of preparations did you make as a journalist, going to this country where, as you said, it was a lawless state, that the laws and the lines were very blurred. And it's not like you were going there to cover, like a day in the life in Libya or like what it's like to live there. You were going to investigate secret prisons. So what were the preparations like? What kind of precautions did you and your team take?
In a lot of places, Mogadishu and Borneo and kind of war zones in Mexico, and nothing compared to Libya in that you never really knew whether you were talking to the right guy. There's one militia that sort of runs Benghazi, and then there's another militia that runs Tripoli, and then the south of the country is the all-out war zone. And so even if you're getting reassurances that you're going to get in safely and that you'll be protected while you're there, you're never really certain. We were working through the Red Crescent, Red Cross, NGO that does a lot of aid work, and they were sort of helping us paper the mission. We also sort of framed to the government authorities, I put that in air quotes, so these were militias that control different parts of the government, that we wanted to sort of tell the European role in and the relationship specifically of how Europe was outsourcing migration control to Libya and trying to get Libya to do the dirty work of stopping people from arriving to Europe. And that was a mixed, Libyan authorities thought, well, we don't love talking about the migrant issue because there's widespread abuse. On the other hand, we don't love being the fall guy for Europe, and their agenda. So there was a part of the story that I think they were open to. In the end of the day, all the promises they made, the Libyan authorities, to allow us access and to pursue the story were bunk. When we got there, we quickly realized that they were not going to let us do what they had promised we would be allowed to do, and we were going to have to try to color around the lines if we were going to get anything done.
Yeah, I mean, in these episodes, through telling Aliou Candé's story, you also detail what it was actually like as media trying to get in and around and move through these spaces. Whether it was just driving around the streets or trying to get into someone's home. What was that like? Was there ever a moment where you were like, maybe I went a little too far with this project?
Yeah, I mean, so let me set the scene. It was a team of 4. One, without spoiling, okay, I will walk up to the edge but not step off. There were 4 of us. A guy named Joe Sexton, who was my editor for many years at the New York Times. A guy named he's American. A guy named Pierre Qatar, who's Lebanese American. Spent a lot of time in Italy. Speaks Arabic, French, English. He was my videographer, a great guy. And then a young woman named Maya Doles, a Dutch documentary filmmaker who was chronicling the work we do. And so this was the team. We had set up arrangements. You can't really, as a Westerner generally, or as a journalist specifically, move through Tripoli without armed guards. So we had negotiated with the government who we would use for that armed protection. And so there was a team that picked us up at the airport and immediately took us to the hotel of their choice, etc. And our plan was to spend 5 intense days talking to everyone we could, go to Gargarash, which is this neighborhood where all the migrants are, talk to ambassadors and aid workers and the like, and go visit the Coast Guard, actually get out on the water and see what their interventions look like, and some government officials. And we did that. And to answer your question, then, second day in, we were put under house arrest. They were angry that we'd gone to Gargarash and that we were talking to the people we told them we'd talk to. So it immediately became adversarial. We pushed the envelope. This is kind of what you do in this setting as a journalist. And they said, okay, you can see Al-Mabani, we'll let you visit. And then they didn't. So we decided to go discreetly and put a drone up over Al-Mabani so that we could see something aerially and inside the facility. They didn't want us investigating the death of this guy, Aliou Candé. We sent a team to the morgue. He had long since left there, but we wanted a sense of setting. We wanted to be able to describe where his body had been taken. That irked them. We talked with the key country ambassadors and aid workers who work with the sub-Saharan Africans who are mostly in these prisons, and that also irked them. So increasingly, we were irking the government until their patience ran out with us.
Right. And so, you wanted to cover the story of Aliou Candé, and, you made all these preparations to go to Libya. And I don't want to use the word coincidentally, but coincidentally, 2 weeks before you travel to Libya, this violent incident breaks out at the prison he was staying at. So what ended up happening to Aliou Candé?
So Aliou gets captured by the Libyan Coast Guard. The boat gets brought back. He and about 250 other migrants are sent to Al-Mabani. They're there for several months. Pretty brutal experience, beatings, etc. A fight breaks out between one cross-section, mostly Sudanese migrants who wanted to try to break out, and they wanted to try to pry open this certain door. And this other section of migrants, mostly West Africans, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, etc., who thought it was a terrible idea because it wouldn't succeed and all that would result is serious beatings. This had happened before. So they began fighting. Ultimately, the guards let the fight play out, watched, encouraged, yelled through the bars that, if they wanted to kill each other, go for it. But then the guards opened fire on the migrants, and one of the bullets hit Aliou in the neck, and he bled out over the course of about half an hour. And that began a whole negotiation between the migrants on one side of the bars and the guards on the other. The guards wanted that body. They didn't want to have to answer questions to the aid organizations or anyone else as to why someone got killed in their under their purview. The migrants realized that the body was their only leverage to possibly getting out. And so they began saying, we're not going to give you the body. You're going to have to come in and get it if you want it and deal with us, unless you're willing to let us out. So that's ultimately how a lot of the migrants got out, was by agreeing to hand over Aliou's body.
And how did you even find all this out? This is such a detailed recount. How did you get this information?
A lot of reporting and luck, frankly, gumshoe reporting, in that we spent time in Gargarash, and it's a sprawling ghetto, with tens of thousands of migrants from every country you can imagine. But word travels fast, and word got around that we were interested in figuring out what happened in that fight and what happened to Aliou. And within 6 hours, we were talking to cellmates of Aliou who pieced together everything that happened. One of them in particular, had kept a really detailed diary, which was a goldmine for us. Then we also talked to aid workers, Doctors Without Borders, and others who had subsequently been involved in asking some hard questions of the prison authorities. So we squeezed them for additional information. And then, putting up the drone and other sorts of things allowed us to also understand what was on the other side of Mabani, inside that prison, because just understanding where folks were kept and where they were, there's a hut behind cell block 4 where people kept saying that was the gas station. That's where people went to get tortured. And when we got the drone up, we realized, oh, there actually is a gas station inside the walls behind it. And it's this walled off area where they do really awful things.
Yeah, yeah. And in the episode, you're detailing you guys trying to get the drone up, and you're over um the prison at this point, and you're trying to lower the drone down and do it safely, and you lower it at this precise moment, and it captures this riveting image of this group of migrants. They were outside, and they were shaped in a square, and they were kneeling over. And you said it in the episode that photojournalism is so powerful. It's the moment that people remember. It's what makes the history. And this specific shot is really telling. What was it like for you and your team in that moment, when you saw that with your eyes over the drone?
Well, nerve-wracking in taking the image, right? So we convinced our minders who were masquerading as our guards, but really they were our babysitters, and they were reporting daily back to the government as to what we were doing. We convinced them to let us give this a try and to stay out of our way. And so they allowed us to ferret out some discreet alley where we could put the drone up. It was a good half mile away from the prison, but we knew we could get it up really high where no one could see it, and then commute over to the drone and then drop low. We did just that. We got lucky. It was lunchtime, so they had a couple hundred migrants out of their cells and all gathering around to eat, the gruel or whatever it is they were serving them in these bowls. And like you said, just the sort of ability to see how much fear there was and how closely packed everyone was. And there was this one very brief 10-second incident that happened that we watched from the drone in live fashion, where all the migrants were about to be marched back into their cell, and they were supposed to be kneeling with their forehead on the back of the guy kneeling in front of them, and they were on the ground. So they were very tightly packed. And one of the migrants made the mistake or whatever of looking to his left. You were not supposed to move your head left or right. And the guard saw him looking, and the guard climbed across several guys and began beating the guy. And this was all on drone. Now, we didn't watch it while the drone was hovering, because we were watching everywhere around us to make sure that no authorities would spot us. But then we brought the drone back, went back to the hotel, and began looking at the footage we'd captured, and we were just blown away at how lucky we'd gotten to actually witness some of these things, if you can put it that way.
Whether it's work, play, or a little of both, the right vehicle makes all the difference. No matter where you're headed, Ted Britt Chevrolet is here to find the perfect vehicle at an incredible price. Lease a new 2025 Equinox EV for just $149 a month, or save over $11,000 off MSRP on a new 2025 Silverado 1500. Visit Ted Britt Chevrolet today in Sterling for savings that take you further, or shop online at tedbrittchevrolet.com. Together, let's drive.
So the final episode of this miniseries, you share this jarring experience that you had right at the tail end of your trip to Libya. It was the last night, and you were in your hotel room. You're on the phone with your wife. You're getting some work done, and all of a sudden you hear banging at the door, and things went south pretty fast. Take me through what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, so it's kind of the journalist's worst nightmare. And it was at the 11th hour, quite literally, in the sense that we were leaving the next afternoon, and we only had one last thing that we had to do before we were going to head to the next phase of reporting, which was in Niger, in the desert, which is actually the place we were most scared of going. We were going to have a huge security presence to be able to go report in that spot. So I thought, okay, we survived Libya, this is great. And the other three were hungry and going stir crazy. And so they took the guards out and went out to a restaurant for dinner. I had stuff to do, called home in my hotel room and heard the knock, assumed it was maybe Joe Sexton, my editor, and he wanted to debrief of the day or plan the next, and opened the door. 12 guys, uniform, weapons drawn, semi-automatics and handguns, came barging in, screaming, yell in Arabic and English, push me back. I've got my wife and my hand on the phone, and I put the phone down. They tell me to get on the ground face down. The first thing they asked for was, where's your tracking device, which was in retrospect fascinating because they had cameras, turns out, in the rooms, in the smoke detectors and such, because I saw footage ultimately that they used during interrogation. But they knew we had trackers, locational trackers on our person at all times so that folks back in the US could keep an eye on us. So they took that away right away. And then they hung up the phone and then they hooded me. And then the beating began. And it was a pretty severe beating that broke a couple ribs and did some damage. It felt like an eternity. I think it only lasted a couple minutes, but it felt like 20. They dragged me out of the hotel, put me in an unmarked car. Same time, the other three are having virtually the same thing happen, but in the middle of an intersection, three pickup trucks rammed their car. The militia grabs the armed guards, beats those guys really badly in the middle of the intersection, hoods the other three journalists, puts them in a van, and takes them to this secret prison, not Mabani, but a sort of on-site prison that the Libyan intelligence service is their official name, but it's a militia called Al-Nawasi. So Al-Nawasi runs this building. They've got some prison cells down there where they do their thing, their interrogations, and that's where we get put. I'm in solitary. Maya, as a female, is also thankfully also in solitary, and the other two guys are put in a cell with each other, and that began about a 4-day captivity until we were ultimately rescued by the U.S. government.
I think one of the most jarring parts of you telling that story is when, you're telling how you were getting beaten by these random men in the hotel. And in that moment, you start to almost compartmentalize, okay, this is going to hurt for X amount of time. This is going to leave this kind of bruise. All while you're literally getting beaten. You don't really know what's happening next. And you have your wife on the phone, which, you're on the phone actively before they tell you to hang up the phone. And this is all going through your mind. Take me back to that moment for you. What exactly was playing out in your head?
Well, one was sort of the quintessential protect the important stuff, so the fetal position, kind of make yourself as small as you can. And I was trying to protect my head because there was a lot of kicking with these guys had boots. And I was trying to also protect my torso and groin. And I was thinking, well, if they were going to kill me, they would have shot me. Because before I got on the ground, I felt the cold muzzle directly touching my forehead. So I thought, okay, well, this is it. But then the beating began. So I thought, okay, well, something worse might be coming, which is a slow motion killing, a performative killing on camera. And this is the beating that precedes. But mostly I was just thinking, who are these guys? And am I going to live this beating? And at the end, there was this moment that I remember still very vividly, in that all the yelling and screaming and kicking stopped, and some guy walked in. I could hear his boots, and I could also sense the silence, and clearly this guy must be powerful. And he said some stuff in Arabic. Everyone seemed to back off. And then he walks over and he puts his boot on my skull. And I'm pretty sure he basically put all his weight on that one foot, because I thought, oh, this is how I'm going to die, because there was so much pressure that I thought he was just going to crush my skull. And then he stepped off, and that's when they scooped me up and dragged me out. But those sorts of thoughts of where am I going? Who are these guys? And are they going to kill me? And then I also started thinking, does anyone know that I'm being taken? When they dragged me through the hotel lobby, I was hooded and I could see down. So I knew the floor, and I could hear them take me through the metal detector. So I thought, well, everyone must be seeing this, because we're going through a hotel lobby and there's blood dripping. And so it's not that secretive, but do my people know that I've been taken? And that's why I was glad I was on the phone with my wife. And lo and behold, the other journalists had also, for better and for worse for me, they knew where I was, because it turns out they were in the same place.
And your wife plays an important role into all of this, because, you're on the phone with her, and I'm sure she's there, and she probably feels almost helpless. She's on the phone. She's in a completely different country. She doesn't really know what's going on. But the hero that she was, she sprang right into action, and she did what she had to do. Um, what was it like for her? I guess this is a story that you guys will look back on, not for the best reasons, but what was it like for her in that moment when you guys kind of talk about that specific scenario? What was going through her mind?
It's a good question. I mean, this was not the first time that this kind of thing had happened. So in Somalia, we a Brazilian videographer and I barely escaped al-Shabaab, a militia there, by minutes, got out of a compound where they were coming to take us. And I was on, again, the phone with my wife leading up to that, and in other places, Borneo and so this kind of journalism is a little bit prone to these close calls. She's pretty stoic, but this was by far the worst and closest it had ever come. I think that she was most afraid that she wasn't going to pull the right lever when it came to the U.S. bureaucracy and get the right people involved, because initially it didn't seem like the wheels were turning in the right direction or fast enough with the State Department and USAID. And then she reached out to Samantha Power, who I can now say this, but it was all secret then, who was head of USAID then, interestingly enough, that's been disbanded, but I'm alive because of them. And Samantha Power was a mom of a student at the school where my wife teaches. And so she reached out to Samantha Power and said, I know this is unusual, but my husband's been taken and can you help? And Samantha Power got shit done. I mean, she everything, the seas opened in a way that they hadn't before. And that's when suddenly State Department was insisting on a proof of life video. They were contacting the Libyan president. They were like, you better find these folks now and deliver them back to us. And that's a big reason I'm alive.
I mean, you said it yourself, this kind of journalism comes, with a bunch of close calls, but it's important work. I wonder what do you tell journalists who are, who may hear this story and may be scared or discouraged to do that kind of work, because, it does come with a quite the price tag, although, it is very important. What advice do you give to them?
Yeah, I don't often find myself where I'm talking much about this. Maybe I should. When it comes up, I had just an incident a couple weeks ago of a documentary filmmaker here in DC Algerian American, who's heading to Libya, and she wanted to talk a lot about the nuts and bolts of how to minimize risk. And so I talk whenever folks ask me about those sort of issues of maybe mistakes I made, things that we did right, but are just impossible to make bulletproof, who are trustworthy folks maybe to work with when there. So I try to give that level of counsel. In terms of the broader issue of the importance of this work, I mean, I think it speaks for itself, and it's not for everyone. And I never have any wise words on that front, frankly. I mean, it's not for everyone, there's a lot of good journalism that doesn't involve this kind of risk that we all need. So it's really something that you should only do if you're okay with it. I would say that I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I don't like danger. I don't seek it out. I like foreign places that make me feel alive because they're so different and confusing. That's true. Guilty as charged. But I don't enjoy going to conflict zones. But if you're interested in really urgent stories that you feel aren't being told, then that's probably where you're going to end up.
Yeah, I guess it's a sort of a pick your poison kind of situation. Right. Ian, throughout the episodes, you refer to the entire migration attempt process as this war. You say it's a war on migration that's being funded by the EU, carried out by the Libyan forces, all with the help of what you detail to be this figurative Army, Navy, and Air Force trifecta. I mean, the imagery of war is pretty drastic. What kind of things did you see on the ground that made you use that word?
Yeah, I appreciate the question because it is a metaphor that I think is unusually apt because you have an armed um, presence that is taking three main forms: Navy, Air Force, and Army. And metaphorically, the Navy, the European Navy that's conducting the armed goal of trying to block people from arriving, is the Libyan Coast Guard. The boats that are used by the Libyan Coast Guard, the coordinates of where they go, what they do when they get there, where they put the people after they capture them, all that is orchestrated by the EU. The SUVs that carry the captives to the prisons, the tablets that are used for tallying how many they were and what nationalities, all EU. So that the guys in the uniforms are Libyans is somewhat irrelevant to the guys calling the shots when it comes to that Navy. Or the Air Force is Frontex. It's the border agency that patrols the borders of all of the EU. And Frontex is flying 24/7 propeller or drone aerial over the Mediterranean with one mission, and that is to spot migrants and to call on the coordinates so that they're stopped. And so that's the armed entity that's doing that part of the war on migration. And then the army, boots on the ground, on land, guys with guns, those are the militias. Those are the guys in Libya that are paid and directed by the EU agenda to house these folks. Libya doesn't care. Under Gaddafi, Libya was a springboard, but a controlled one for migration to the West. But the militias care because it's a money-making business where they can extort the migrants and earn, and they can also take aid dollars from the EU to keep these migrants from reaching Italian, Greek, Spanish soil. And so it's a good business model for the militias in Libya. But at the end of the day, this is all being serviced and orchestrated by the EU.
Well, Ian, I am waiting patiently for the rest of the season to come out so we can hear the rest of your time investigating for the Outlaw Ocean Season 2. Ian Urbina, director of the Outlaw Ocean Project and host of the Outlaw Ocean Podcast. Thank you so much for talking with me today. I'm so glad you're alive, and I'm so glad you are still doing the work that you do.
Thanks, Maria. I appreciate it.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Maria Kestane. Thanks for listening.
Whether it's work, play, or a little of both, the right vehicle makes all the difference. No matter where you're headed, Ted Britt Chevrolet is here to find the perfect vehicle at an incredible price. Lease a new 2025 Equinox EV for just $149 a month, or save over $11,000 off MSRP on a new 2025 Silverado 1500. Visit Ted Britt Chevrolet today in Sterling for savings that take you further, or shop online at tedbrittchevrolet.com. Together, let's drive.